Hello friends. Today we are going to talk about defense of poetry and what are the arguments has been given by P.B. Shelley. We are going to discuss that. So let us start. This article is written to defend poetry because there were a number of discussions and controversies were going on before this, and Shelley thought of giving a complete understanding about poetry. So in the beginning, this poetry regarding those two classes of mental action which are called reason and imagination. The form may be considered as mind contemplating the relation. The former may be considered as mind contemplating the relation born by one thought to another, however produced, and the later as mind acting upon those thoughts so as to color them with its own and composing from them as from elements other thoughts, each containing within itself the principle of on integrity, its own integrity. So Shelley says that he's actually talking about two things, reason and imagination. He says reason is as if a mind contemplating on a number of thoughts. There are thoughts one after another, you can actually count them, and imagination acting upon those thoughts, or it is as if coloring. So reason connect one thought to another, or furthermore, and imagination is as if contemplating on those thoughts or acting upon those thoughts. Reason is a form of synthesis, and imagination is a principle of analysis. So in reason, if you can say it is a quantity or difference, then imagination we can say quality and similitude. So if we find reason differentiate between the thought, one thought to another, and there is a difference, but the similarity of thoughts we can find out in imagination. So then he give example as if the relation of agent with the instrument. Any artist who is working, or any technocrat who is working with an instrument. So whatever the relationship between them two is there, and the same relationship is with the reason to imagination, and how the relationship of shadow with substance and a body to spirit. So these three things he says that this reason and imagination, if we have to understand in the concept of poetry, then we can say how agent is associated with the instrument, how shadow with substance, and a body to spirit. So these are certain similitude and differences of the qualities are there. Then further he says poetry in general sense may be defined to be the expression of the imagination, and poetry is cannot with the origin of man. So poetry it actually emerged with the existence of the humanity. The moment a human being came in the existence and they started thinking, contemplation started, and that is the origin of poetry. Then he compares poetry and its music with the Aeolian lyre. Aeolian lyre is an instrument and which is creating melody when it comes in the contact of air, or if you touch the string of that instrument. And how this expression of this Aeolian, he says, which moves it by their motion ever-changing melody, but there is a principle within the human being, and perhaps within all sentient being, all sentient being, which act otherwise than in air, and produced melody alone. So this how the relationship of an air with the Aeolian. In the same way, poetry has relationship with human being, the existence of the human being. So then he says, as if a 7 is to ages, the child is to years. And poetry talks about similar manners, language, gesture, And it also talks about pictorial quality or imitation. So the one significant aspect of human being, which is imagination. Imagination is the extra quality of humans, and poetry is actually the production of that imagination. That he says that a poet is a social being determined in action and capable of becoming the equality, unity, diversity, and contrast mutual dependence. And it constitutes pleasure in sensation and virtue in sentiments. So the relationship which we find the way a seed which is having the quality of a big huge tree in it, in the same way a plant is having that quality which was there in the seed, but because the size of the seed is so small, until and unless it is given a place and environment where it can flourish. So in this way a poet also has that seed and quality in understanding the world. So how a poet finds out beauty in art, truth in reasoning, love in interaction, and imagination is expressed in many forms. These are the qualities of a poet. And how the motion of dance, melody of song, and rhythm rhyme. Poets follow order. All man has order, but poet has more order. So the language of poet could be metaphorical, but it is always rhythmical, symmetrical, and it expresses. So every man in the infancy of art observe an order which approximates more or less closely to that form of highest delight which results in poetry. So the language is poet's language is vitally metaphorical, and it gives lot of expression. Shelley says, these similitudes or relations are finally said by Lord Bacon to be the same footsteps of nature impressed upon the various subjects of the world. And in the infancy of the society, every author is necessary a poet, because language itself is poetry. And to be a poet is to apprehend the truth and beautiful in word, the good which exists in relation, substituting first between existence and perception, and second between perception and expression. Every original language near to its source in itself is a chaos of cyclic poem, and copiousness and distinction of grammar are the work of later age. So initially, every expression which comes by human being has a tinge and impact of poetry. But poets, or those who imagine and express this indestructible order, are not only the authors of language and of music, of the dance and architecture and statutory and painting. They are the institutions of laws and founder of civil society, and the inventor of the art of life, and teachers who draw into certain propinquity with the beautiful and true, that partially apprehension of the agencies of invisible world which is called religion. Hence, all original religions are allegorical or susceptible of allegory, and like Jesus have double face of the Janus have a double face of false and true. So in this way, how the poet create imagination which is reflecting the life. Then Shelley says, poet present future and prophet, a poet present future and prophet foretell. So poetry almost attributes to the future, and it could sign the futuristic embrace also. Poets behold intentionally the present and future in a present also. Prophet in the gross sense of word, they foretell the future. So a poet who, when we compare poet to the prophet, A prophet could actually foretell future, but poet could tell you the past, the present, and the future. So the expression of mode of time, differences of persons, and distinctions of the tree. These are the qualities of poet. The color, form, motion, and more plastic and obedient to the control of the faculty of which is in creation. The language is arbitrarily proceeds by the imagination and relation to thoughts alone. And further he talks about the hieroglyphic art. Hence the fame of sculptor, painter, musician, although the intrinsic power of the great master of these arts may yield in no degree to that of those who have employed language as the hieroglyphic. And we all know what is this hieroglyphy. Hieroglyphy is a art. Hieroglyphy is the writing is in the form of diagrams or in the form of figures. For example, birds and different signs and symbols. So and then there is a comparison of the music produced by harp and guitar, and how the poets are the legislature and prophet of the world. So further he says that of their thoughts have never equaled that of poet in restricted sense of terms, and two performers of equal skill will produce unequal effect from a guitar and a harp. The fame of legislature and founder of religion, so long as their institutions last, alone seem to exceed that of the poet in restricted sense. But it can scarcely be questioned whether, if we deduct the celebrity which their flattery of the gross opinion of the vulgar usual conciliates, together with that which belong to in their higher character of poets, and excess will remain. So the explanation is that any institution, or even the people who establish institution, they could take their legacy for some time, but poet could be immortal, and it could defy ages. And that is why the quality of a poet is beyond institution. In fact, in this text only saying that a poet is much bigger than an institution, because an institution is having legacy and a system, and it sustains the time and space, and it has history and hierarchy. But a poet is much more than that, beyond that. Hence the language of poets has ever affected a retained uniform and harmonious recurrence of sound, without which it were not poetry, scarcely less indispensable to the communication of its influence than the word themselves without a reference to that particular order. So poetry create order, and the people, general people, are also in the harmonious nature. But the poetry produce measured and unmeasured language altogether, and the poet's mind is in much more, or the perception of the order and the relations of thoughts. It's uniform, it is certain and uniform, harmonious, and this reflection we could see in the act of the poet. And then he says that an observation of the regular mode of recurrence of harmony in the language of poetical mind, together with its relation to music, produced meter and certain system of traditional form of harmony and language. So, and then there is a comparison how the poetry and prose could be compared, although it is distinct. So this distinction between poets and prose writer is a vulgar error. The distinction between philosophers and poet has been anticipated. Plato was essentially a poet. So Plato was essentially a poet, and the truth and splendor of his imagery, the melody of his language, are the most intense that it is impossible to conceive. He rejected the measures of the epic, dramatic, and lyrical form because he sought to kindle a harmony in thoughts diversity in shape and action. He forbore invent any regular plan of rhythm which would include under determinate form and varied pause of his style. Cicero sought to imitate and during his time period, and he with little success. Lord Bacon was a poet, and his language has sweet and majestic rhythm, which satisfy the sense no less than almost superhuman wisdom of the philosophy satisfied the intellect. So, all authors of revolution in the opinion are not only necessarily a poet as they are inventors. And now, every word unveils the permanent analogy and image and participation of the truth of life. So, in a way, as Shakespeare, who born in 1564, Dante 1265, Milton 1608, and they all gives us the sense of history preserved and information. So when we compare story with the poem, which is the next idea of Shelley, he says the story is a partial and it is applied only in the definite period of time. It has certain combinations and events which cannot go beyond a time period. But a poem is universal, which contains within a germ of earlier actions, and whatever the motive and action it has placed, it has the nature and it has timeless existence. So poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that is distorted. So poetry is timeless. Poetry is it has there are so many qualities which poetry has, and let me give you the synonyms which are being used for poetry. Poetry has color, form, music, rhythm, thought, imagination, architecture, painting, sculpture, music, love, devotion, moral portion, patriotism, friendship, and it has civil life, military life, it has war, discipline, order, victory, command, fight, humor, and it has a beauty, patriotism, devotion, and friendship, immortality. So there are technology and lexicography, engineering, everything. I mean, whatever you could think of existing in this world is included in poetry. So poetry has a rhyme, meter, and rhythm. Poetry has, it invents. Poetry has language, music, color, form, rhythm, metaphor. And what was more significant for Plato, that he says thoughts must have harmony. And there are again 3 M's which are being used for poetry, that is music, motion, and meter. So everything what you say, everything what you imagine is a form of poetry. And there are endless lists and numbers and words Shelley has given here, and it is a language of vitality, and it is a language of metaphorical expression. So whatever you think of under this universe is a form of poetry. So the comparison of a story and poem is clear enough. Now, how we go for the historical references of poetry, and the poetry is the mirror which makes beautiful which is distorted. So it is not only change the form, color, and it contains the combination of human nature. it has the capability of altering even the superficial look also. And whatever it is disconnected, poetry connect it and make it as a complete picture, harmonious picture. So and then he says, poetry is ever accompanied with pleasure, and all spirits on which it falls upon themselves to receive the wisdom which is mingled with its delight. In the infancy of the world, neither poets or auditors are fully aware about the excellence of the poetry. There is one significant thing. For that, I have made a picture also. If you could see, this tree is there, and a nightingale is sitting here. So, this tree, you just see the tree, and a nightingale is sitting here. And Shelley says, a poet is a nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer its own solitude with sweet sounds, which gives pleasant feeling to the human beings. And we all know that those who are the philosophers, the poet, the artists, the sculpturer, the painters, and they left a wonderful legacy for humanity. And one of them is the poems of Homer and his contemporaries were the delight of infant Greece. They were the elements of that social system which is the column upon which all succeeding civilizations has reposed. Homer embodied the ideal perfection of his age in human character, nor can we doubt that these who read his verse were awakened to an ambition of becoming like to Achilles, Hector, and Ulysses. The truth and beauty of friendship, patriotism, and preserving devotion to an object were unveiled to the depth in these immortal creations. And further he says that, but poet considered the vice of contemporaries as a temporary dress in which his creations must be arrayed, which cover without concealing the eternal portions of their beauty. So, the poet is so particular about the time and space, and it gives the sense of endless inventions. The whole of, so that is why the divinity is attached with the poetry. So poetry acts in divine manner, and poetry lights the veil from the hidden beauty of the world. And the poetry enlarges circumference of imagination. And immortality of the poet lies in the moral improvement of man. So how the humanity is improved with the time period, one of the most significant aspects associated with this is poetry. And a man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. Poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination by replenishing it with the thought of ever new delighted. Poetry strengthens the faculty which is the organ of the moral nature of man. And in this further legacy, those in whom the poetical faculty thought great is less intense, as Euripides, Lucas, Tasso, Spenser have frequently affected the moral aim of human life. And architecture, painting, music, dance, culture, philosophy, civil life, civil society, and these are all inherent part of poetry. So when we talk about Athenian drama, which is a form of lyrical poetry, and there is another reference of cyclic poems. Cyclic poems is these are the early Greek epic poetry, which has a lot of information and historical references also. So Homer and the cyclic poets were followed a certain interval by the dramatic and lyrical poets of Athens, who flourished contemporaneously with all that is most perfect enkindled expression of poetical faculty, architecture, painting, music and dance, culture, philosophy, and we may add the form of civil life also. So poetry existing in chivalry and Christianity has it has a lot of institutions which is existing in the modern Europe. And there are number of the verbal or the movement associated with poetry. When we talk about the language of the poem, it is the highest idealism of the passion of power of human being. So the language employed in the poem, it has action, music, painting, dance, and even if the power of the religious institution. So poetry is ever found to coexist with whatever there. The art which is contributing to the happiness and perfection of the humanity. And the drama which is associated with poem is for the Athenian employed language, action, music, painting, and dance, and religious institution to produce a common effect in the representation of highest idealism of passion and of power. Each division in the art was made perfect in its kind by artists of the most consummate skill, and was disciplined into a beautiful proportion and unity one towards to other. On the modern stage is a few of the elements capable of expressing the image of poet's conception are employed at once. We have tragedy without music and dancing, and music and dancing without the highest impersonation of which they are all fit into the action. So the modern practice blending comedy with tragedy, though liable to the great abuse in the joint of practice, is undoubtedly an extension of the dramatic circle, but the comedy should be as in King Lear. It has universal idealism and sublimity. Now there is one instrument which you could see, and this is known as if you could see, this instrument is there, and this instrument is known as harp, and the another is lyre. So these are the two ancient Greek instruments, and they has a melodious and beautiful sound. And how this there is one concept which is given, that is choral poetry. Choral poetry is a type of lyrical poetry that was created by ancient Greek, and it was accompanied by an instrument which is known as lyre. And the shape of the lyre, if you could see, this is the shape of the lyre of this instrument, and it has a very beautiful sound. So the poetry is not only inventing the music. This is Aeolian lyre, this is lyre, and this is harp. So these are number of instruments which are actually making the melody into words, and this text. Poetry is a sword of lightning, ever unsheathed, which consumed the scabbard that would contain it. And thus we observe that all dramatic writing of this nature are unimaginative in a singular degree. They affect sentiment and passion, which divested of imagination and other manner of caprice and appetite. The period in our history of the gross degradation of drama is the reign of Charles II, when all form in which poetry had been accustomed to be expressed became hymn to the triumph of king's power over liberty and virtue. Milton stood alone, illuminating an age unworthy of him. So, whatever the misuse of poetry we find during the reign of Charles II, Milton stood alone against that, and the power which he could gain out of this, that is poetry. So poetry is one of the strength which could actually change the time of the universe. The drama being that a form under which a great number of modes of expressions of poetry are susceptible of being combined than any other. The connection of poetry and social good is more observable in the drama than in whatever other form. And it is immutable that the highest perfection of human society has ever corresponded with the highest dramatic excellence, and that the corruption or the extinction of the drama in a nation where it has once flourished as a mark of corruption of manners and extinction of the energies which sustain the soul of social life. So what Machiavelli says of political institution that life may be preserved and renewed if man should arise capable of bringing back the drama to its principle. So if any society which is having the purest form of drama, the society can never be corrupted, and the manners and the upliftment of the moral of the society would be very high if it has the most significant form of drama. So drama is the best fertile land for the expression and growth of poetry. And in any society, if the drama is in the proper form and order and without corruption, then the society could never demoralize and get degenerated. So in civil war, the spoils of Asia and the fatal predominance first of the Macedonia, then the Roman arms, were so many symbols of the extinction or suspension of the creative faculty of Greece. The bucolic writer who found patronage under the latter tyrants of Sicily and Egypt were the latest representative of the most glorious reign. Their poetry is intensity melody like the odor and tuberose. It overcomes and sickens the spirit with the excess of sweetness. So bucolic writers are the writers who representing rustic life, the village life, the pure form of life. And these writers, they were without the patronage of the tyrant Sicilian Egyptian kings, it would have been difficult for them to survive. So, and that is why they were forced to write those which was in favor of king. But still they kept the rustic and the village life as a theme of their poetry. So bucolic and erotic delicacy is in written poetry is correlative with that softness in the statutory music and kindred art, and even in the manner and institutions which distinguish the epoch to which I now refer. So this Shelley is talking about the bucolic poetry, its origin and its significance, which actually sustained the purity of the form of poetry, even if it being patronized by some tyrant rulers. So poetry ever communicate all the pleasures which men are capable of receiving. It is ever still light of life, the source of whatever beautiful or generous or true can have place in and time. These are the significant virtues which we could understand out of this text. And then he gives number of references of the ancient writers who not only kept the history and the spirit of humanity in a high form, but they actually gave direction and order to the society. So Livy is instinct with poetry. Horace, Catullus, Ovid are generally the other great writers of Virgilian age, saw man and nature in the mirror of Greece. The institutions also and the religion of Rome were less poetical than those of the Greece, as the shadow is less vivid than the substance. Hence poetry in Rome seemed to follow rather than accompany the perfection of politics. The true poetry of Rome lived in its institutions. For whatever the beautiful truths and majestic they contained could have sprung only from the faculty which create the order in which they consist, and the contribution goes to poetry. So the life of Camillus, the death of Regulus, and the expectations of senators in their godlike statues and victories, a refusal of republic to make after the battle, and any rule or any region which denied the purest form of poetry, they were bound to fall and bound to vanish. It is probable that the poetry of Moses, Job, David, Solomon, and Isaiah had produced a great effect upon the minds of Jesus and his disciples. Jesus has actually changed the order of the world, and his mind was also impacted by the poetry. The poem in Doctrine of Jesus Christ and the Mythology and Institutions of Celtic Conquerors of the Roman Empire outlived the darkness and confusion connected with their growth and victory. So, in this way, when we talk about the slavery and representation of women in the society, and how could poetry make it so sublime and easy? The abolition of the personal slavery is the basis of the highest political hope that can ever enter into the minds of man to conceive. The freedom of woman produced the poetry of sexual love, and love became a religion, an idol of fools ever present. So this slavery of the system and the community and the women representation, which also get a boost when it is included in the poetry, and that's how the representation of women in a number of writings, Dante, Raphael, and Milton, Virgil, these are they contain itself with the philosophical refutation of the system and the natural order which is being questioned. So when we talk about the representation of women and dignity of women in the society, then poetry comes first. It defends the rights of the women very aggressively. The Divine Commedia and Paradise Lost have conferred upon modern mythology a systematic form when it changed the all-time have added one more superstitions to the mass of those which have arisen and decayed upon the earth. Commentators will be learnedly employed in elucidating the religion of ancestral Europe, not only utterly forgotten because it will have been stamped with eternity of genius associated with the poetry. So Homer was the first and Dante was the second epic poet, and the second poem, the series of whose creations bore a definite and intelligible reaction to the knowledge and sentiment and of the ages which followed, developing itself in correspondence with the development. Dante and Milton were both deeply penetrated with the ancient religion of civilized world, and its spirit exists in the poetry probably in the same portion as its form survived in the uniformed worship of modern Europe. Dante was the first religious reformer, and Luther served in the rudeness of acrimony than in the boldness of his censures of the papal usurpation. Dante was the first awakener of the entranced Europe, and he created a language in itself, music and persuasion. So, and that is why the power of the poetry could be seen in the writings of Dante. The age immediately succeeded to that of Dante, Petrarch and Boccaccio was characterized by a revival of painting, sculpture and architecture. Chaucer caught the sacred inspiration and superstructure of English literature is based upon the materials of Italian invention, and we all know how great Chaucer as a poet is. But poets have been challenged to reign the civic crown to reason and mechanist. On the another plea, it is admitted that the exercise of imagination is more delightful, but it is alleged that the reason is more useful. Let us examine as the ground of this distinction was here meant by utility. So, at number of places we find that poetry is being questioned, and there are number of the antitheses are being given, but still the exertion of the thoughts, the moral condition of the humanity, and which is being represented by Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Calderon, Lord Bacon and Milton had ever if we question that if these writers and the poets would have ever existed, they would not have existed, then what would have been the condition of this universe, this civilization? So Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Calderon, Lord Bacon and Milton had ever existed, if Raphael and Michelangelo had never been born, if the Hebrew poetry had never been translated, if a revival of the study of Greek literature had never taken place, then what would have been this condition of this present time. If no monument of ancient sculpture had been handed down to us, and if the poetry of the religion and ancient world had been extinguished together with its belief, the human mind could never, except by the intervention of these excitements, have been awakened to the invention of the gross science and applications of analytical reasoning to the aberrations of society, which it is now attempted to exalt over the direct expression of inventive and creative faculty. So, if these legacies which we are enjoying, and we have the privilege of having more refined mind, would have never been existing if we forget the translation of the Hebrew poetry, if we forget the contribution of Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Milton, Shakespeare, and all. The poetry in this system of thoughts is concealed by the accumulation of facts and calculating process. There is no want of knowledge respecting what is wisest and the best in moral, government, and political economy, or at least what is wiser and better than what man now practice and endures. So, the function of the poetical faculty are twofold. One, it creates new materials of the knowledge and power and pleasure. By the other, it endangered the mind a desire to reproduce and arrange them according to a certain rhythm and order which may be called the beautiful and the good. The civilization of poetry is the cultivation of poetry is never more to be desired than that period. From an excess of the selfish and calculating principle, the accumulation of the material of external life exceed the quantity of the power and accumulation them to material of human nature. The body has been become too unwidely, and which seems to be animates. So, this legacy which we need to understand. Poetry is indeed something divine. It is at once the center and circumference of knowledge. It is that which comprehends all science, and that to which all science must be referred. It is the same time the root and blossom of all the system of thoughts. It is the form which all spring and which all adorn, which if a blight denies the fruit of seeds, withhold from the barren world and nourishment and succession of the cycle of the tree of life. So it is perfect and consummate surface, blossom of all things. It is the odor and color of the rose to the texture of the elements which compose it, and form and splendor and fade beauty to the secret of anatomy and corruption. What were true love, virtue, patriotism, friendship, whatever the scenery of this beautiful universe which we inhabit, we were our consolations on the side of grave, and what were our aspirations beyond it. If poetry did not ascend to bring light and fire from those eternal reasons where the owl-winged faculty of calculating dare not ever soar. Poetry is not like reasoning, the power to exerted according to the determination of the will. So that's how the poetry has so much significance. Milton conceived the Paradise Lost as a whole before he executed it in a portion. We have his own authority also for the muses having dictated to him the unpremeditated song. And poetry thus makes mortal of all that is best and more beautiful in the world. It arrests apparitions which haunt the interlocutions of life, and veiling them, the language in form, send forth among the mankind, hearing sweet news of kindred joy to those with whom their sisters abide. So, poetry is the record of the best and happiest moments of the happiest and the best minds. And poetry turns all things to loveliness. It exalts the beauty of that which is most beautiful, and it adds beauty to that which is most deformed. It marries exaltation and horror, grief and pleasure, eternity and change. It's subdued to union under light yoke, and all irreconcilable things. It transmutes all that is touched, and every form moving within the radiant of its presence is changed by wondrous sympathy to the incarnation of the spirit which is breathed. Its secrets alchemy turns to potable gold, and poisonous waters flow from the death throat. It strips the veil of formality and word, and bear the naked and sleeping beauty which is the spirit of its form. So all things exist in as they are perceived, at least in relation to the percipient. The mind is its own place, and of itself can make the heaven of hell and hell of heaven. But poetry defeats the curse which binds us to be subjected to the accident of surrounding impressions. And here there is a wonderful reference which we could find, that if Homer is called drunkard, or Virgil flatterer, Horace coward, Tasso madman, Lord Bacon peculator, and Raphael libertine. But still, these are the allegations which we can put, but the contribution of their to the humanity is immense, and it cannot be measured. So that's how, let us assume that Homer was a drunkard, that Virgil was a flatterer, the Horace was a coward, Tasso a madman, Lord Bacon was a peculator, and Raphael was a libertine, and Spenser was a poet laureate. It is inconsistent with this division of our subject to cite living poets, but posture then ample justice to the great names now referred to. So that's how their reference and their significance is so understood. And what is a poet? Because there are a number of definitions. Through definitions, we could understand what Shelley is saying. What is a poet? The frequent recurrence of the poetical power, it is obvious to suppose, may produce in the mind of a habit of order and harmony, correlating with its own nature and its effect upon other minds. But in the intervals of its inspirations, they may be frequent without being durable. A poet becomes a man, is abandoned to the sudden reflux of influences under which other habitually live. But as he is more delicate organized than other men, sensible to pain and pleasure, both his own and that of others, it is degree unknown to them, he will avoid the one and pursue the other with an ardor proportioned to this difference, and he renders himself obnoxious to calmly when he neglects and observes the circumstances under which these objects of universal pursuit of flight and disguise themselves in one another's garments. So those of the poets and those of the mind working as a poet or contemplating is something unique. It has complete control over thoughts and emotions, and a poet is so significant that he could control his own emotions and reflexes which is there in the mind, and he could actually contemplate on the thoughts of others and create a poem. So the most unfailing herald, companion and follower of the awakening of the great people to work a beneficial change in opinion of the institution is poetry, which is created by poet. So poets are hierophants of an unapprehended inspiration, the mirror of the gigantic shadow which futurity casts upon the present. Hierophants are generally a priest who interpret things. So in this way, finally, Shelley says, the poet is the unacknowledged. Poets are the unacknowledged legislatures of the world. So kindly subscribe my channel, Success Matrix, and thank you for watching and listening this. Thank you so much.